All right, everybody take a deep breath with me. Okay, cleanse the palate. We're going to head right into the next discussion. Those of us who follow the doing of science know that journalists have been reporting recently about irreproducibility, retractions, fraud, sponsorship, and other issues surrounding the scientific process. These issues can erode public trust in the science and scientists. To many in the public, these violations of scientific integrity can be hard to distinguish from the self-correcting nature of science, which tries to replicate and falsify existing findings in the pursuit of new knowledge. Exactly what are the threats to the reputation of science? What does basic research in trust and credibility tell us about how best to address these issues as they apply to science? And how can we better communicate these issues in the context and norms of science? We are pleased to introduce a stellar team today to help us explore these important questions. I'd like to welcome Kathleen Jamieson as the moderator for this session. She is a professor of communication and director of the Annenberg Public Policy Center at the University of Pennsylvania. Okay, at the age of 11, Kathleen won a blue ribbon at the Minnesota State Fair for a speech on stocking your home fallout shelter. She is joined by Suzanne Fisk, a professor of psychology and public affairs at the Princeton University, who nearly 50 years ago was dragged away from a nonviolent anti-war protest and spent a night in Boston's Charles Street jail. About 4 decades later, she checked in again at what is now the Liberty Hotel. Let's also welcome Kevin Finneran, editor-in-chief of Issues in Science and Technology, who says he shouldn't be trusted to talk about reproducibility because his original academic training was in English literature and film studies. And finally, Marcia McNutt, 22nd president of the National Academies of Sciences and winner of a slew of silver buckles for barrel racing on horseback. So please welcome our multifaceted group here, and Kathleen, over to you.
I'd like to begin by creating an overview and asking what's the dominant narrative of science, and answering it is self-discovery and its quest. It is not problems, it is not crises, it is not science, is not self-correcting, it is a good narrative. And ask the second question, is scientific self-correction fueling a science's broken narrative in this context in which the dominant narrative still remains discovery and quest? So let's look at the first. If you look across the whole horizon of what we see about science and ask at the end of the year, what do they summarize? They summarize breakthroughs, and in general, those are breakthroughs that have helped humans. We looked at news coverage from major news outlets that had gotten the greatest amount of coverage. These are scientific publications that had gotten the greatest amount of coverage to try to ask how they were covered. We did content analysis, and we looked at the underlying structure, and we found that they involve scientific institutions. They note the significance of findings. They contain words like breakthrough, advance, and path breaking or paradigm shifting. They include specific words in the headline that are consistent with that, and very few, however, mention false starts or past failures. And what this suggests is that the discovery narrative, by not including the false starts and those instances in which science didn't get it right, mistakenly creates the impression that science is a linear process that goes from intuition to discovery without those intervening steps. One potential problem with that narrative is that when we get fraud or false starts, people may think that's aberrational instead of inevitable in the scientific process. We also found that 87 situated the finding as part of an ongoing inquiry or included a forecast of future research, something that looks hopeful because it raises the understanding level, we believe, in the public that this is in fact an iterative process. Is science as self-correcting a part of that narrative, and is the scientific enterprise's effort to locate problems driving an alternative structure? You'd look at this headline in The Economist and say, scientists like to think of science as self-correcting. To an alarming degree, it is not, and wouldn't realize that scientists found those problems, disclosed those problems, and were in the process of correcting those problems at the point at which The Economist framed the problem as science not being self-correcting. Most scientists can't replicate studies by peers. Same problem with this headline. The very scientists who are identifying this are pointing us in a direction of inquiry towards solutions that many of them are involved in trying to implement. Science is facing a reproducibility crisis, where more than 2/3 of researchers have tried and failed to reproduce. How do we know that? Scientists found that, and they are addressing the crisis with solutions. Quote-unquote crisis. So is the science's broken narrative in media being driven by reports of increasing retractions, failures to replicate, and failures in peer review uncovered because science caught them? The answer is yes. But is it yielding headlines that suggest science is broken? That is also yes. We looked for science is broken and in crisis headlines. This was the search. The original search pulled up 121 articles. We eliminated duplicates. We looked at 76. Of those, 31 focused solely on a new scientific finding. 26 were authored by a scientist. 22 noted that science is self-correcting or made a comparable statement and recommended at least one solution. And 5 indicated the problem is exaggerated or not real. Now notice the dominant framing of those articles is being driven in part by scientists identifying a problem, not being clear about the fact that this is evidence of self-correction and not offering solutions in the process, even though those same scientists are involved in solving the problems they have identified. And so what we have is a science is broken narrative in our headlines. Science is broken narrative in our headlines. Notice there are no solutions in the headlines. Science is broken in the headlines. And problem-solution headlines are rare. That is my context for a discussion which we are now going to engage in. But first, we're going to have presentations by the distinguished scholars on the panel. Susan.